Good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to the fourth and final thematic conference as part of the Housing 2030 initiative, which is brought to you by the three partner organizations, Housing Europe, UN Habitat, and UNECE. So, today's event, Shaping Investment Pathways to Deliver Affordable Housing. We're very proud that it's being presented in partnership with our colleagues at the Housing Agency in Dublin. We had hoped to be with you live in Dublin for today's event, but unfortunately, the ongoing pandemic has made that impossible. But at least we can be together in this online format, which has actually proved to be quite successful for the three previous events, and we hope that it will be equally successful today. We are very happy that we are at our limit today. We had 500 people register for today's event, which is a fantastic result. And looking at the attendee list, I see that even if we're not in Dublin, we have a very strong Irish flavour to today's event. And indeed, welcome to all of you joining from my home country, where I haven't been home in over a year, but it's good to be with you today anyway. So I just want to take you very quickly through the agenda. So we'll begin in a moment with a brief introductory remarks from John O'Connor, the Chief Executive Officer of the Irish Housing Agency. Then we'll have a short introductory statement from Minister Dara O'Brien. Unfortunately, the Minister cannot be with us live this morning, but he has recorded a video statement for us that I'll play for you. Moving on, we'll then have brief introductory remarks from representatives from the three partner organisations, Dara Sandoni from UNECE, Bent Madsen from Housing Europe, and Robert Lewis Lettington from UN Habitat. After that, we'll have our keynote address from Josh Ryan Collins from UCL, and then that'll be followed by the Affordable Housing Finance Toolkit, which has been developed for Housing 2030, and that will be presented by Michelle Norris from UCD. After that, we'll have our Q&A session with three fantastic speakers. Again, Michelle Norris will be joining us, Manuel Albers from KU Leuven, and Gegos Gaida from the European Investment Bank, and they'll be discussing different pathways to investment in affordable housing. Then we'll give you a quick coffee break, and then we're into our final session of the day, which is a kind of elevator pitch style presentation of various examples of good practice around financing and regulation of finance. So we have speakers from Ireland, from France, from Denmark, from Spain, and from Poland. And then we'll wrap up with some closing statements from the co-chairs of the Housing 2030 initiative. And then we'll get you out of here at about 11:45, that's Irish time, so it'll be 12:45 if you're joining us from mainland Europe. So I'd like to, without further ado, pass over to John O'Connor from the Irish Housing Agency to make a few brief comments. John, you're very welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dara. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to everyone from Europe and from around the world. We have some people joining us from Australia and from New Zealand this morning. So thank you all for joining. I'm John O'Connor, the Chief Executive Officer of the Housing Agency. We're a government agency in Ireland with a vision to create sustainable communities. The Housing Agency works with and supports municipalities, which we call local authorities, housing associations, the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, and other organisations such as the Housing Finance Agency, the Residential Tenancies Board, the Land Development Agency, and many other organisations, both in the public and private sector. We are delighted to support Housing Europe's Housing 2030 initiative. The need for effective housing policy and systems to support affordable housing is of such great importance, and you're going to learn everything you need to know about funding affordable housing and financing affordable housing this morning. Housing 2030 is an excellent initiative in how we can learn from each other and find ways to improve our affordable housing outcomes. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone that has been involved and worked so diligently in relation to the work being done on Housing 2030. So I'm just going to move now to introduce the Minister. It is my pleasure to now introduce Dara O'Brien, Minister for Housing, Local Government and Heritage, who will give the opening address today. I hope we all learn from and enjoy this conference this morning. So I'll hand you over now to the presentation by the Minister. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for providing me with the opportunity to speak to so many European colleagues this morning at the Housing 2030 conference, which has the theme of improving housing affordability through access to finance and funding. Providing affordable housing for our citizens is a common challenge facing all countries in Europe. It's a challenge we must meet to improve the lives of citizens and to provide a stable foundation for the well-being of our communities. As you're all aware, the past 12 months have been very challenging for the housing sector, with delivery greatly impacted by restrictions introduced to protect public health. This year, most housing construction in Ireland ceased for almost 14 weeks. This was a significant pause in the delivery of housing and will unfortunately impact on that delivery in 2021. Despite these unprecedented challenges, we have been progressing new policies, particularly in relation to affordability, which will reshape delivery of housing in Ireland and deliver on the government's commitment that everybody should have access to good quality housing to purchase or to rent at an affordable price, built to a high standard, offering a high quality of life. My department recently commissioned work from the ESRI, and we know we're going to need around 33,000 homes a year across all tenures to keep up with population growth and demand for housing. To meet our commitments, funding of 3.3 billion was allocated in Budget 2021 towards the delivery of housing, the single largest housing budget ever. This is to support the delivery of 12,750 new social homes, including a record 9,500 new builds this year in 2021. We know COVID will have had an impact, but we're doing everything in our power to make up for some of that lost ground. This summer, we'll be publishing a new housing strategy, Housing for All, to set out our ambitions and how we're going to deliver them. The delivery of more affordable and social homes will be a key focus in the plan. The plan will also set out measures to address homelessness, both through the delivery of new homes, but also the provision of supports that many homeless people need, particularly in the areas of mental health and addiction. Supporting our most vulnerable citizens will be a key objective of the plan, and we'll be aiming to deliver 50,000 new social homes. The main focus will be to deliver new build homes to reduce reliance on the private market and to put the local authorities back at the heart of housing delivery. Affordability is recognised as a key challenge in the housing market. The government is committed to ensuring that affordable quality housing solutions are available to everyone in Irish society, and this is reflected clearly in the Programme for Government. The Programme for Government commits to putting affordability at the heart of the housing system through the progression of state-backed affordable housing. I'm currently progressing a new affordable housing bill through our own Parliament, and this government has committed funding for this year of €468 million specifically to cover affordability measures. This includes funding for the introduction of a new targeted and focused shared equity scheme. It is intended that these schemes will be targeted towards eligible first-time buyers who are seeking to buy a new home but who cannot quite secure the full mortgage amount to do so at this stage. And subject to the final qualifying criteria, these schemes would see the state take a limited equity stake in the property in order to allow purchasers to meet the total cost of their available mortgage. To date, using the €310 million Service Sites Fund, my department is committed to funding to support the delivery of and facilitating infrastructure that will see almost 4,000 more affordable homes on public land. And I'm also committed to the introduction of a new cost rental sector in Ireland. It's been modelled on similar sectors that successfully provide affordable rental accommodation elsewhere in the European Union. In Budget 2021, a new fund of 35 million was provided to our approved housing bodies to access low-cost loan finance over a 40-year period for up to 30% of the cost of the provision of these homes. A further 100 million of matching finance is available at competitive rates through our housing finance agency for the remainder of the costs. And these funds will help reduce rents for the tenants of these homes. In the longer term, we intend to expand this scheme to deliver at scale and would hope that private bodies will help contribute to this sector the terms and conditions of which are being finalised as part of my affordable housing bill that I mentioned earlier. In addition to the delivery of homes by our approved housing bodies, the further development of the cost rental sector will be supported by local authorities and our new Land Development Agency. Funding streams such as the European Investment Bank, international pension funds and other interested in this long-term and sustainable form of housing provision may play a central role in the delivery of cost rental homes at scale. The Land Development Agency is a new state agency which will work with state bodies and with local authorities to make more effective use of state lands, providing a stable, sustainable supply of land for housing. It's planned that the Land Development Agency will be capitalised from the proposed provision of 1.25 billion in the Irish Strategic Investment Fund, and that will happen this year. The agency will play an increasingly significant role in the delivery of more affordable housing, as set out in our programme for government. As it stands, it's currently developing 9 sites that have near-term delivery potential of 3,600 new homes, the majority of which will be for cost rental and affordable home purchase. In the longer term, it will assemble strategic land banks from a mix of public and private, making these available for housing in a controlled manner, which will bring essential long-term stability and sustainability to the housing system. In concluding, I'd like to reiterate the fact that last year, just over 20,000 new homes were completed, with just under 8,000 of those as new social homes. And I'm very conscious that we need to increase this substantially. And I'm under no illusion of the challenges ahead of me to make sure that we meet these targets. Through the introduction of our affordability measures, we will meet the needs of families that do not qualify for social housing supports and are excluded from high prices in urban areas. We will focus on delivering at least 10,000 new social homes each year over the coming 5 years, and this will continue downward trend on waiting lists, which are down 10% from 2019 to 2020 and down 1/3 since 2016. Our new strategy, Housing for All, will further outline the mechanisms we're developing to utilise land, provide infrastructure and explore new and innovative forms of delivery to ensure there is a home available for everyone who needs one. Finally, I'd like to thank Housing Europe, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe and the UN Habitat for inviting me to speak with you today. This conference comes at a pivotal time for affordable housing in Ireland and indeed elsewhere in Europe. It's incumbent on us to deliver affordable homes for our citizens. We have much to learn from each other, and for Ireland in particular, we have much to learn from our European colleagues. I'm sure this conference will provide a great basis to do just that. Gur míle maith agóibh go léir.
Okay, thank you very much to Mr. O'Brien and indeed to John O'Connor for those introductory statements. I'd now like to move on from the opening comments to our first partner, which is the UNECE, and indeed we have Dara Sandoni with us this morning. Doris is the Director of the Housing Department at the Ministry of Finance and Economy of Albania. She is also the Chair of the UNECE Committee on Urban Development, Housing and Land Management. Doris, you are very welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dara. Distinguished delegates, participants in this conference, on behalf of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe's Committee on Urban Development, Housing and Land Management, I'd like to welcome you at this fourth and final in our series of thematic workshops, Shaping Investments Pathways to Deliver Affordable Housing. Excuse me, which is held in the framework of the Housing 2030 initiative. Special thanks to Housing Europe for the organization and the Housing Agency of Ireland for co-hosting the event. And I would also like to thank UN Habitat for the cooperation in this initiative. As I mentioned, this is the fourth of activities of that started since last year with specific thematics, which refer also to the chapters of the report study on Housing 2030. We had about workshops on land, on environment and governance, and today's workshop is about financing. Land and financing are the cornerstone of a housing system. If both of them are available and accessible, for us that are engaged in policy making, there is not much to do. However, urbanized land is scarce and comes at high prices, while access to housing financing is cumbersome and not affordable to everyone. Moreover, in the aftermath of the global crisis, public budgets for housing were cut or reduced, resulting in a more residual social and affordable housing sector. The unprecedented situation created by COVID-19 pandemic emphasized the need for adequate housing, especially for those that live in precarious situation and have no access to housing, adequate housing. Financing, and in particular for residential purposes, is one of the areas mostly transformed in the digitalization area, which makes possible fast and easy the transfer of money and investments, but which is also associated with increasing concern on transparency and fairness, and with what is known as financialization of housing. This new term, but not phenomena, that the English vocabulary doesn't recognize yet, refers to structural changes in housing and financial markets, whereby housing is treated as a commodity and as a means of accumulating wealth, rather than as a human right that has led, and this has led to unaffordable housing prices, insufficient affordable housing in the market, and discrimination. And I would also like to refer to the podcast that I listened yesterday, on financialization, which was very interesting. And I would also advise to follow the podcasts that are published in the Housing 2030 webpage. Well, that's why the discussion on this topic today has generated the interest of more than 400, but this morning I learned that there are some 495 participants that are following this activity from all over the UNEC region. Housing finance has since long been part of our committee's program of work. A number of publications available online address from different perspectives and in different times this subject. I'd like to remind that the Geneva UN Charter on Sustainable Housing, developed by the committee and endorsed by the UNECE in 2015, underlines the importance of governments and stakeholders contributing to the well-functioning, efficient, equitable, and transparent housing markets and land markets, which respond to different types of housing demand, as well as favoring credit access for socially and economically vulnerable groups of population, including through alternative forms of funding. The Charter also stresses the importance of promoting investments in sustainable housing through private and public investments, public-private partnerships, and other means of financing. So I'm looking for the fruitful discussion and very interesting discussion on this subject today. I'm also looking forward for the finalizing of Housing 2030 report study, which, when finalized, is to be launched at the UNECE Ministerial Meeting on Urban Development, Housing and Land Management, which is titled Affordable, Adequate and Resilient Housing in Livable Cities, and which will take place on 6 October 2021 at the Palais des Nations in Geneva. I'd like, in this occasion, to use this opportunity to invite you to register to participate in the ministerial meeting. The ministerial meeting is also expected to endorse a regional action plan for the UNECE region on promoting sustainable housing. The regional action plan is building on outcomes of the study, so on what we are also discussing today. And the regional action plan is being developed and will be presented soon to member states of the UNECE for consultation. For those that doesn't know what is UNECE stand for, is United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, is one of the 5 economic commissions of United Nations, which cover states from Canada, United States, Europe, Central Asia, so 56 member states. And at the end, I wish a good discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doris. And from Albania, we now move to Copenhagen, where we have Bent Madsen. Bent is the president of Housing Europe. He is also the managing director of BL, the Danish Federation of Non-Profit Housing Providers. Bent, it is a pleasure to have you with us again this morning. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dara, and thank you to you, colleagues and friends, for being here with us this morning for the final of the 4 thematic conferences as part of Housing 2030 initiative. I have been informed that today we have over 400 people registered to today's event. That is very, very many, and shows the interest and shows the interest there is for the issue of investment in affordable housing. And this has been a question for many years now, and we know that we need greater investment, but we don't necessarily know how to access it. And we heard something which was very fascinating from Ireland and very positive. And looking at today's agenda, I'm very optimistic that we will be able to get some answers. And this morning, David all said that we will get all the answers. And I will hope so, David, and look forward to today's conference. As Dara said, I come from Denmark, and I can tell you that adequate supply of social and affordable housing is not a given. It takes planning, it takes commitment, and of course, meaningful investment, but it can be done. When we look at social housing in Denmark, back in 1960, it accounted for less than 10% of the housing stock in Denmark. And today it's around 21% of the housing stock. The Danish National Housing Fund, it has played a key role in this, providing a stable and affordable finance for developing a high quality social housing in Denmark. And my colleague, Solveig Råbjerg Tinge, she will come later today and will provide you with some further details on this fund. And I would like to be very clear on one point related to the theme of today's event. Investment in affordable housing has to be done in a way which is sustainable and of a good value for the state and of course for the residents. Work by the OECD has shown that in recent decades, governments have scaled back their investments in bricks and mortar in social housing in favor of supporting individual households through housing-related supports. And this is not a sustainable solution to improving the long-term housing outcomes. To borrow a metaphor from Professor Michel Norris, who I'm very delighted to have with us today, the current investments approach in many governments in dealing with housing issues is like to fill a bucket with a hole in it. Money is invested by governments and by agencies, but it does not stay in the system and helping to meet the housing needs for the one generation and on to the next generation. And this is not sustainable it's not a sustainable way to use the public funds. It's not an effective way for dealing with the housing affordability issues that so many households in the UNECE region faces. Indeed, this speaks to the very foundation of the Housing 2030 initiative, highlighting common housing issues and promoting tools and policies which have been shown to be effective in dealing with them. Solutions, they are indeed available. We just have to be willing to use these tools. Housing 2030 has been a long process, and seeing this as the final conference, I'd like to conclude my remarks here this morning by expressing my sincere thanks to Dr. Julie Lawson and the rest of the writing team, collaborators and external experts for all of your efforts. As President of Housing Europe, I would also like to express to our partners in the UNECE and UN Habitat our sincere thanks. It has been a pleasure working with you on this initiative. And finally, I know that we had hoped that today's event would be taking place in the beautiful city of Dublin. But as also said by Dara, this cannot be possible in times like this. But nonetheless, today's event has a distinctly Irish flavor on it. And I would like to thank you, the Housing Agency of Ireland, of all of their support, not just for today, but over the whole lifetime of the Housing 2030 initiative. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible in October for the official launch of the Housing 2030 report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bent. And moving quickly along to our final opening address, which is from Robert Lewis Lettington. Robert, I'm not sure exactly where in the world you're joining us from this morning, but you are very welcome and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I think the video is appearing. Excellent. Well, this morning I join you from Geneva. COVID considerations imposed, so I am at least within the Housing 2030 region for now. Ladies, gentlemen, partners and friends, it's my pleasure to join the other hosts and partners in welcoming you, this time on behalf of UN Habitat, to this online workshop on the role of housing funding and finance to support affordability. Since its foundation, Habitat has worked to promote the realization of the right to adequate housing for all as one of the transformative forces that can lead the world to overcome challenges related to climate change, poverty, exclusion, and inequality. In 1961, the Economic and Social Council of the UN asked UN Habitat's predecessor to consider, and I quote, successful techniques for mobilizing national resources for the extension of low-cost housing and urban development, as well as the appropriate methods for expanding and effectively utilizing international resources, which may become available for the extension of housing and related community facilities. Of course, the regional economic commissions were also invited to participate in this work. The funding of affordable housing and partnership with the economic commissions to explore options in this area has always been central to UN Habitat's mission. Housing has often been recognized as a high priority social issue, but it is also part of the basic nuts and bolts of healthy urban economies and healthy urban governance. In the decade of action on the Sustainable Development Goals, the 10 years running up to 2030, we committed as Habitat to ensure that the growth of cities and nations around the world translates into more equally distributed opportunities and positive outcomes, and that no one and no place is left behind. UN Habitat's principal urbanization work towards this goal consists of three outcome areas. One, increased and equal access to basic services, sustainable mobility and public spaces. Two, increased and secure access to land and adequate and affordable housing. And three, effective settlement growth and regeneration. Despite decades of recognition of the challenge, policy work and cooperation on issues of adequate housing remains woefully inadequate. It is far too subject to cyclical interest, even if that does seem to be on an upturn at present. We need a sustained policy emphasis on investment in adequate housing that is accessible, safe, affordable, and that meets the needs of different groups in society, including an aging and a more diverse population, persons with disabilities, young people and their families. I'm happy to note Minister O'Brien's emphasis on affordable housing policy in a broad sense. Consideration of affordability in both personal and public senses is important. Further, recognition that while we need to address the immediate needs and symptoms that result from the current housing crisis, long-term solutions require their own plans, and that approach is fundamental to the health of the sector in the future. The COVID-19 crisis has contributed to highlighting the importance of this task. The pandemic has reinforced how housing is a central determining factor in people's and communities' health, dignity, and well-being. If cities continue to be divided starkly along lines of income, gender, ethnicity, and migration status, leaving no one behind will be progressively more difficult. The current simultaneous housing and public health crises in many parts of the world are placing a political spotlight on housing and on the need for public action to achieve an adequate standard of living for all. For this reason, I'm particularly pleased to be here today to celebrate Housing 2030 and the collaboration with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe and with Housing Europe on the topic of affordability. This remains the fastest growing and most pervasive housing challenge in the European region, and often translates into increasing urban poverty and, of greatest concern, homelessness. The challenge of better understanding how to increase access to quality and affordable housing in various contexts by shaping housing funding and finance policies to support the delivery of appropriate levels and types of well-located housing, and where appropriate to regulate housing costs, is made even more urgent by the growing income instability triggered by the economic consequences of COVID-19. Housing 2030 is therefore as timely as it is critical. We are confident that its work to facilitate the identification, sharing, and exchanging of experiences and good practices will allow the formulation of viable solutions and appropriate policies for specific national and local contexts. I would like to close by especially thanking the Housing Agency of Ireland, which is co-hosting this workshop, as well as thanking again the Housing Agency and all of the other partners which are powering the Housing 2030 initiative. Thank you for your efforts to achieve adequate, accessible, safe, and affordable housing for all, and I wish you a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Robert. I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker for today, which is Josh Ryan Collins. Josh is the head of finance and macroeconomics at UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. His research interests include money in banking, sustainable finance, the economics of land and housing, and economic rents. He is the author of 3 books: Where Does Money Come From?, Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing, which was included in the Financial Times Best Economic Books of 2017, and Why You Can't Afford a Home, which made the case for excessive mortgage credit as being the primary driver of housing affordability crises in advanced economies. Josh, on behalf of the Housing 2030 initiative, I would like to thank you very, very much for taking time to be with us this morning, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Dara, and thanks to all the organisers, UNACE, Housing Europe and UN Habitat, for this fantastic initiative, Housing 2030, which is exactly what is needed, I think, to deal with the issues we're discussing today. I'm going to focus very much on the big picture structural challenges. I'm a macroeconomist rather than a housing specialist, so I'm going to go big, and I hope that by the end of what I've got to say in the next 20 minutes, people will hopefully have a better understanding of the structural drivers of the housing crisis that we face in Europe and beyond. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. I've got a couple of slides just to go through. Just to say, I work for the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which is a public policy institute at UCL. So we're very much focused on the role of the state in actually shaping markets and creating better outcomes for people. What I'm going to focus on in the next 20 minutes is firstly the sort of puzzle of why do we have high house prices that have risen so fast, so rapidly against incomes, in particular since the 1990s, which is made clear in this chart. This chart just shows, I think this is for 16 high income economies, the house price to income ratio, which is the standard measure used to assess affordability. And what you can see here is that before the 2000s anyway, there was some evidence of a sort of housing cycle around an equilibrium long run average, which is the black line on your slide there. But from the 1990s, we had this steep rise in that ratio, housing becoming more expensive relative to incomes, leading up to the financial crisis, of course. what's interesting is that post-crisis, whilst there was a fall, there wasn't a fall back to that long-run average, and rather there was a sort of recovery, as you not the right kind of recovery, but an increase again in house prices against incomes from the sort of mid 2000 and sort of 2012, 2013, and things picked up again. So there wasn't a market correction. So the question then becomes, was this really a huge bubble, or is there something more systematic going on here? That's the first question. Now, the dominant approach to the problem of affordability, I think influenced in particular by sort of mainstream economics, neoclassical theory, is that it's a supply side problem. We're just not building enough homes to meet the demand of expanding population or people becoming wealthier. And so, yeah, the basic issue is supply. If that was the case, of course, one would expect the house price to rent ratio to also be increasing. One would expect rents to be going up rapidly against incomes. And that has been the case in some cities. However, on average, we see a very similar pattern with the ratio of house prices to rents that we see for house prices to income. So you can see here, in fact, house prices have risen against rents even faster than they have against incomes since the 1990s. So that suggests it's not actually, on average anyway, a supply side problem, because if it was a supply side problem, rents should have risen against incomes in the same way that house prices have. So if it's, and the other challenge with the supply side argument, of course, is we have numerous examples of housing bubbles, such as the one experienced in Ireland, for example, and in Spain. These are the two biggest European housing bubbles that occurred in the run-up to the financial crisis of 2008. Of course, Ireland and Spain, as probably many of you will know, were building considerably more houses than anyone else in Europe, yet they had the biggest bubbles in Europe and in the world, essentially, in the run-up to that financial crisis. So it seems like even though lots of new units were being built, the house prices kept going up. So the supply side doesn't seem to be an explanation that we can be comfortable with. Of course, there are exceptions. There are always places, cities in particular, where there is a lack of affordable housing. I think everyone can sort of agree on that. But if we're thinking about the fundamental drivers, there seems to be something else going on. Now, one argument that recently has become more popular in housing economic circles is that this is to do with the fall in interest rates, specifically the fall in real interest rates, that is, adjusted for inflation. So inflation's been actually very low and falling, as have interest rates. And this chart just shows that in fairly clear fashion. This is the so-called world real rate, which is based on inflation-linked estimated from inflation-linked bonds in advanced economies, and the US 10-year yield is shown in blue there. So you can see this gradual fall, which picks up a bit of speed from the 2000s, the sort of mid-2000s, which perhaps helps us to understand what's going on, because essentially if the interest rate on government bonds and other so-called safe assets that investors and households invest in, if that yield falls, that makes real estate and housing relatively more attractive. So the return on housing, whether that's rents or the capital gains you make on housing, becomes relatively more attractive vis-a-vis other financial assets. However, there are also problems with this explanation. It also is not a very strong explanation for understanding the volatility you see in house prices, the fact that we have these regular cycles of boom and bust, because you see there's not much evidence of cyclical behavior in that chart. I mean, there's a very clear downward steady trend in interest rates. Central banks tend to not rapidly play around with interest rates. It tends to be more gradual movement, half percentage point here, half percentage point there, etc. And the other thing the interest rate theory struggles to explain is the fact that actually there's quite a lot of diversity in this house price to income ratio across country, quite a lot of cross country differences. So this chart just shows you how, in fact, in Germany, Japan and Korea, we have quite a different trajectory on that house price to income ratio. In all of those countries, for the majority of this period we're talking about, from the mid-1990s, the housing's actually become more affordable. That ratio has been falling. Of course, those countries have experienced exactly the same interest rate fall in real interest rates as all the countries that have experienced rising house prices relative to income. So interest rates, I think, is part of the story, but it doesn't seem to be the full story. One might argue perhaps that it's necessary, but not sufficient to explain housing affordability dynamics. My argument is very much that we need to be thinking about land rather than housing, and the dynamics, what's unique about land and finance. And so, this chart just shows you quite starkly, really, that it's land that is the thing that is driving the volatility in house prices. This just shows the UK land and house price index since 1945 from one of my books. You can see here enormous volatility in land values. A couple of three major booms in the UK housing market. In the early 1970s, that was more of a commercial real estate issue. Then we had a crisis in the late 80s, and then the financial crisis. So some recent research shows that 80% of the increase in house prices in advanced economies since the 1950s is explained through rises in land values. House prices, the cost of building a home, the structures, tends to appreciate in line with inflation, unlike land values, which are very different. Now, my argument in my work essentially is that land and credit, or money, finance, whatever you want to call it, are two economic commodities with very different properties. And what you need to do if you want to understand housing affordability is understand their interaction over time and how that changes. So land, we know, is inelastic in supply, in particular in cities, but generally one can argue it's one of the least elastic commodities we have. People want to live in the same types of area. Everyone wants to live near where they work, in a pleasant environment, near the decent schools. It's inherently finite and limited in supply in that sense. In contrast, credit is created by banks. When they make loans, they create new money. Confidence is the main thing that determines whether or not they lend. And obviously we have huge amount of capital markets have got bigger and bigger and bigger over time. So there's a huge amount of money seeking out yield. So these are opposite sorts of dynamics in terms of supply. Land is fixed and immobile. Credit is global. We've seen that with deregulation of global capital markets. Land appreciates in value through time, enables rent extraction for whoever owns it. Economic rent is what I'm talking about there. Essentially control over a scarce asset needed for production. This makes it a key source of collateral for the financial system, because banks know that real estate property will appreciate over time, that it can't be hidden, that it's easy to identify. It's the preferred form of collateral for banks and for the wider financial system. The economic role of land is conflicted, as we've heard already. It's both a consumption good and it's a financial asset, a means of storing and accumulating wealth. So those two functions are in tension all the time. Credit and money, of course, can support investment, capital investment and economic growth, but it can also just flow into existing assets, financial assets, but also real estate assets, and just inflate those assets. And that, I think, for me, is the key driver. And what we need to do really is understand how changes in financial regulation and the structure of the banking system have evolved over time to a point where today the majority of bank lending flows into existing homes, enabling people to buy existing homes. And of course, we had this deregulation in the 1980s, and prior to the 1980s, commercial banks didn't really lend very much against property at all, which is very hard to imagine when you think about it today. We're very used to getting a mortgage from the bank, but we actually had specialized circuits of mortgage lending. Much more conservative building societies and mutuals tended to dominate mortgage lending. And we didn't have this sort of huge increases in credit that are pumping up house prices. There's various studies which show that mortgage finance is the most important determinant of house prices, adjusting for elasticity of supply and other controlling factors like interest rates. So you don't need to just take my word for it. There's lots of econometric studies which demonstrate this is the case. And of course, the other major change in the 1980s and 90s was the international rules around bank capital. The Basel rules began to change and favor real estate. So you need to hold much less capital if you're lending against a property than if you're lending to a small business, which is seen as much more risky. Of course, that's true on an individual cases, but of course, if you aggregate up, then you can end up with systemic risk where more and more banks are pumping money into housing, and you get the problem of housing bubbles. And the other thing you've had is governments focusing very much on subsidizing the demand for housing, whether it's first home buyer loans, home equity schemes, and mortgage interest rate relief. All of these are further subsidies for the banking system rather than for the provision of affordable land, for example. All of this has led to the situation we have today, where you've seen, for me, a very clear evidence that it's the explosion in mortgage credit from the mid-1990s that is the key driver of house prices. So in this chart, house prices are plotted on the right-hand axis, the dotted black line, and mortgage credits in blue. And you can see non-mortgage credit, that is lending by banks to businesses, is pretty much sort of stabilized actually since the 1990s. It's the growth in bank credit has been almost all from lending against property, and almost all of that is for lending against existing houses, enabling people to compete with each other for bigger and bigger mortgages, and enabling more and more people to come into the housing market with more and more credit. And these dynamics are complex, and they are reinforcing. So you've got a number of reinforcing feedback loops in the sort of land finance ecosystem, not in all countries, but in many countries, including Ireland, I would argue. And certainly in the Anglo-Saxon economies, these dynamics are extremely strong. So you've got this financial deregulation and innovation, residential mortgage-backed securities, real estate investment trusts, which enable also capital markets to be bought into the housing investment cycle. And of course, all this additional credit pumps up house prices, increases household debt. This leads to rising house prices, increasing land value capture, because the taxes on properties are typically lower than other financial assets. There's no tax at all, no capital gains tax at all if you're on your primary residence in nearly all European countries and nearly all advanced economies. So it's a great way of capturing wealth as prices go up. Of course, rising prices increases the demand for more mortgage debt, increases demand for mortgage debt, and rising collateral prices makes it easier for banks to lend more against property because the collateral is increasing in value. So there's strong pro-cyclical dynamics here. Of course, rising prices means there's more political pressure on governments to provide subsidies for first-time buyers, for example, and a weakening non-market housing offer as more and more people want to get in on the the great house price inflation dynamic. And of course, rising household debt puts pressure on central banks not to increase interest rates, because that would risk financial stability issues if a lot of people with big mortgages suddenly see their interest rates rise. So, and of course, lower interest rates then feeds into more financial innovation as banks seek ways to make more money as the interest rate spreads on their loans falls. So all of these dynamics are going on, and the question is really the key question, I think, if you're in affordable housing's key structural question is how you break down some of these cycles. Post the financial crisis, we saw on the positive side, I think, central banks embracing what's called macroprudential policy, where they're addressing those systemic risks in the system rather than just focusing on individual risks at an individual bank level. So central banks have increased loan to value ratios, loan to income ratios, for example, made it harder to get loans for borrowers, and in some cases increased the amount of capital banks have to hold against mortgage loans. Of course, there are problems with this policy because it basically discriminates against poorer people, makes it harder for poorer people to buy homes. So there's an inequality problem there. Nevertheless, on balance, I'd say it's a positive thing. It has brought down the amount of mortgage credit flowing into housing by domestic banks in most countries. However, you've had other things going on. So you've had a re-embracing of securitization. The European Union's Simple, Transparent, Standardized program has actually lowered capital requirements for residential mortgage-backed securities, which has meant more capital market institutional investment money flowing into housing. We've had quantitative easing programs, which have driven down the yields on government bonds. We've had the opening up of social housing to the private rental sector in many European cities. So investors coming in and buying up social housing, often lifting up rents. And of course, low interest rates also mean that private developers can borrow cheaply to invest into real estate. And in many cities, we see the result of that being huge increases, in particular in house prices relative to incomes, as essentially cities become the new gold, as the rates on safe assets fall.
My apologies, Josh. Sorry, I might ask you to begin the process of wrapping up, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. Just a few concepts on alternatives, really. I think it's important that we think about structural reform of the banking system. What we need is banks that are able to de-risk their loans by virtue of developing relationships with businesses over time, rather than always insisting on collateral in the form of real estate. So so-called stakeholder banks rather than shareholder banks. I think big state investment banks will be key as well, and we have some good examples in Europe already of the KfW of this, focusing on building affordable housing. And you can see here, just from seeing the UK and Germany, quite different results in terms of the amount of mortgage credit against house prices with these different types of banking ecosystems. Recently, we've had some discussions of central banks including house prices in their inflation targets. New Zealand has talked about doing this. Interesting, because New Zealand was the first country to make central banks independent. They're now becoming the first country to force central banks to include house prices in their inflation targets. I do think property tax is key. A land value tax would be a way forward, because you'd be taxing those speculative gains. So I'd very much support that. But how do you do it in a way that doesn't alienate people? And then finally, I think we just fundamentally need to think about land and who owns the land, and public sector ownership of land. The Land Development Agency that the minister was talking about sounds like an excellent idea. Some of the countries which have avoided the rise in house prices against incomes are those countries like Singapore and South Korea, where the state has a much stronger control over land and what it's used for. And I'll finish there. If you want to find out more about my work, there's my publications. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Josh. And indeed, The two books that he showed on the screen there, I've read both of them, Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing and Why You Can't Afford a Home. And I would highly recommend them to anyone who is interested in Josh's presentation, because he touches on many of the same themes, but in a lot more detail, and they're really worth checking out. So I would like to now move to presentation of the Affordable Housing Finance Toolkit, which will be provided by Michelle Norris from University College Dublin. Michelle is a professor at the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice. Her research focuses on the management and financing of social housing, the regeneration of social housing in urban areas, as well as comparative approaches to housing policy in Europe. Michelle is also the chairperson of the Housing Finance Agency of Ireland and serves on the board of the New Irish Land Development Agency. Michelle, I realize we're running a few minutes behind schedule, but take your time, take the full 20 minutes, and we'll make it up later on in the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dara, and I'm really delighted to be here this morning, and just sorry you can't be all joining me in person in Dublin. Today I'm going to talk about the funding and financing part of the Housing 2030 report. But just to explain to you, just in case not everyone is aware, the Housing 2030 project is focused on showing how policymakers can improve housing affordability outcomes and at the same time play a constructive role in addressing the ongoing climate change challenges and stimulate the social and economic recovery now required following the COVID-19 pandemic. So, as I mentioned, today I'm going to talk about the housing funding and financing tools that can be used to achieve this goal, and the content of the chapter of the Housing 2030 report, which examined these issues. So the chapter was drafted by me and also by my colleague, Dr. Julie Lawson, from the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT University in Australia. And Julie is the lead author of the Housing 2030 report and really has done just a phenomenal job in pulling together this really challenging report that looks at a huge number of countries. So just to acknowledge Julie's contribution, and also that of the other Housing 2030 researchers who made an input, at the UNECE, UN Habitat and Housing Europe staff and members who made an input, and also the governments of the 56 UNECE member countries who put forward examples of good practice. It wasn't possible to include all of these in the report, but we've tried to include as many as possible. And you'll also from the widest variety of countries possible. And you'll get to hear some examples of different practices in different countries from people involved in implementing some of the examples of good practices later in the morning. So the Housing 2030 report is focused on a four-step approach to shaping better housing markets and addressing housing affordability. So these steps encourage policymakers to look at, firstly, why is housing affordable and inaccessible in some countries? What changes to the housing system could be used to increase affordable housing? What policy tools are required to generate the outcomes required? And finally, what capabilities are required to implement this policy at the affordable scale, at the appropriate scale? So the entire report and the wider Housing 2030 project focuses on four issues, and there's four associated chapters of the report. These examine the governance of housing, access and availability of land for affordable housing, climate neutral housing, which is affordable and inclusive, and finance and funding for investing in affordable housing. So we've already had 3 very successful webinars on the first 3 of these issues. And Julie and I were also involved in drafting the section of the report on land for affordable housing, which addressed many of the issues that Josh mentioned in his presentation. So each of the sections of the report are focused on identifying policy tools that policymakers can use to address these challenges. And they also include illustrations of practice from different countries from around the UNECE world region. So I want to stress that this toolkit, which we identify in the report, isn't meant to be a universal blueprint that can be applied everywhere. Obviously, the housing system is enormously complex, and particularly in relation to housing finance, tools that may work very effectively in one country just can't be applied in another country. If, for instance, the social housing sector is smaller, if, for instance, the commercial banking sector is different, and also tools that may be useful to address particular affordability problems in one country may not be useful to address affordability problems in other countries. So what we have done is identified a toolbox of potential tools policymakers could apply, and we encourage policymakers to examine these tools and adapt them to meet their particular housing needs within their country or within their city municipality area. So the tools we examine in the housing funding and financing chapter are intended to address the following strategic objectives that are listed on the slide here: shaping the housing financing system we need, delivering housing with affordability and access as the focus, ensuring housing costs are affordable, accessing efficient and effective investment, encouraging reinvestment to sustain quality in affordable housing, and also using taxation that supports good housing outcomes. So I'm going to move on now and look at some of the tools we examine in the report. Not all of the tools, but some of the tools to give you a flavour of what's in the report. And I'm going to look at how the different tools can achieve the different objectives, and also look at some of the examples we've identified of how these tools have been applied in practice by different governments. So I wanted to start by focusing on the issue of strategic policy and regulatory frameworks for the housing sector. Even though Josh and I didn't speak before we prepared our presentations, our analysis of this issue in the report chimes with many of the issues Josh has flagged in his presentation. So I was quite struck by that. While researching the report, we realised that it is comparatively rare now for governments to have a comprehensive strategic policy and regulatory framework that covers the entire housing sector. So in most developed countries now, housing policies focus overwhelmingly on addressing market failure to provide affordable housing, and there are few examples of policies which aim to address the market finance drivers of unaffordability, which Josh flagged in his presentation, such as increased speculative investment, the enormous increase in credit, and also equity finance that's driving house price inflation. So in the report, as you can see from the slide, we've identified two examples of very valuable UN initiatives that are intended to address this issue. But we came across very few examples from national or municipal government to address the management of the financial sector as a whole, and action at both national and international level right across the housing finance system is necessary if we're going to really address affordability by addressing the factors that are driving unaffordability rather than just trying to fill the cracks by funding affordable housing provision. So a good example of this problem is the issue of taxation. So taxation is one of the mechanisms most commonly used by governments to intervene in housing markets, of course. And we do examine in the report how it's being used effectively in the case of France and the United States to improve affordability for low-income renting households. But many low-income households can't really be helped very much by taxation because they don't pay tax or they pay relatively little tax. But taxation is one of the most obvious mechanisms which could be used to control the finance market drivers of unaffordability, such as speculation, financialization, etc. But when we looked around the UNECE region, we identified relatively few examples of where the policy has been used in that way. Denmark was one, as you see in the slide. This is definitely an area of housing policy which requires more attention from policymakers and also from researchers to identify strategies that governments can use, including tax and regulation. Now, saying all that, it is still very important that governments intervene to address market failure to provide affordable housing. And the provision of non-profit affordable housing is one of the most effective mechanisms to achieve this and one of the most widely used mechanisms, particularly in Western Europe. So this is a particularly valuable mechanism because providing affordable and secure housing is core to the mission of non-profit providers. And also they don't need to extract a profit for investors, so they have the potential to deliver housing at much more affordable prices than for-profit providers. But in order to achieve this, appropriate financing is necessary, and we examine this in the report, but also appropriate regulation of non-profit providers is also required to ensure they actually deliver on their mission in practice. So we've illustrated this section with examples of good systems of this type from France, Denmark, and Austria. Apart from subsidising the capital costs of affordable housing provision, subsidising rents is the most common mechanism used by governments to promote housing affordability. So these have the advantage in that they're flexible measures that can be easily targeted at the most needy. But just like mortgage interest subsidies mentioned by Josh, if rent subsidies are not carefully managed, they can drive inflation in rents and therefore undermine affordability. And there's lots of evidence in the Irish case that they have done that. So we've illustrated this section of the report with examples of well-designed measures from the United States, from the Netherlands and Hungary, which have been effective in addressing unaffordability while avoiding generating these perverse outcomes. The other common response to unaffordable rents is rent regulation. And from the perspective of government, this has the benefit of being significantly cheaper than subsidising rents. It's effectively free for government. Now, in recent years, rent regulations have become increasingly unpopular among many economists who claim that they impede the supply of private rented accommodation. But the review of the evidence on rent setting, indexation and regulation, which we present in the report, demonstrates that the negative impacts of these measures really depends in practice on their design and their flexibility. And this is demonstrated by examples of the useful application of these measures in practice in the Netherlands and Germany, which we've included in the chapter, and also an example from Spain, which I know Javier will be talking to you about later this morning. Although the discussion on financing affordability often focuses on large-scale and long-term finance, such as mortgages and housing development loans for social housing landlords, large-scale finance isn't required to address all affordability problems. And in lots of countries where the banking sector is very underdeveloped and there are significant pressures on national governments, and the social housing sector is underdeveloped. Large-scale finance of this type just isn't available. Also, in countries where home ownership is very widespread, and particularly where self-building of homeowner housing is common, small scale, or what we call here microfinance for housing, small loans can have a really positive impact in enabling homeowners to modernize their housing and improve their housing. So this approach of microfinance for housing has been pioneered by the charity Habitat for Humanity. And in the report, we examine its successful application in Macedonia and in Romania. Another simple but very effective way of financing affordable housing is to use circuits of household savings to finance affordable housing. Josh mentioned in his presentation that this was, of course, traditionally the main source of finance for mortgages in many countries via savings and loans organisations in the United States, for instance, and building societies in the UK. But particularly in the English-speaking world, this source of finance has disappeared, and many of these organisations have been shut down or converted to for-profit institutions. And here in Ireland, we no longer have any building societies. But this is not the case everywhere. And this model is still used very successfully in Germany and Austria to finance mortgages for homeowner housing via their savings bank Barkasse system. And they've also exported this model successfully to several countries. And in the report, we examine its successful use by the Housing Construction Savings Bank of Kazakhstan. The model is also used to finance social housing in France, and it provides a very useful alternative to government loans and grants. And I know that Virginie will talk to you about its application in France later this morning. So even though using different sources of finance for affordable housing, such as non-profit finance via Sparkasse, can be very useful, it's still important to emphasise that public loans and grants are vital for affordable housing provision. And most housing of this type would not be provided without some form of a public subsidy. Government grants in particular are useful because they enable affordable housing providers to borrow less money to build or buy affordable housing, and therefore they reduce the delivery costs. But public funding doesn't have to be the sole source of finance. It can be used to leverage private or non-profit finance, but some public funding is necessary in almost every case. So in the chapter in the report, we examine how loans provided by the Council of Europe Development Bank for affordable housing can be matched by finance from other sources and have been used very effectively to deliver affordable housing right across Europe. We also suggest that public finance should be what we call purposeful, in the sense that it should come with some strings attached to ensure it delivers other policy objectives, such as environmental sustainability, for instance, and this is a requirement for CEB funding. Public funding for affordable housing is often operationalised by means of mechanisms to reduce borrowing costs, such as interest rate subsidies, loan guarantees, and loan insurance. Now, Josh in his presentation mentioned some of the risks of this model, where it has been traditionally applied to subsidise homeowner mortgages and has contributed to house price inflation. But it has been used very successfully to drive down the borrowing costs for social housing provision. And in the report, we examine some very effective examples of the use of these types of mechanisms in Finland, in the Netherlands, and also in Canada. Another old and simple but very effective idea to finance affordable housing is the idea of a revolving fund, whereby money is lent for affordable housing provision, and then when it's repaid, it's lent out again. This was how social housing in Ireland was originally funded over a century ago. And it's been a very effective mechanism to fund housing provision for low-income homebuyers in Albania, for instance. Also in Denmark, this model is used by social housing landlords. And in this country, once the development loans taken out to build or buy social housing are repaid, tenants continue to pay rents, and some of this money goes into a central pool, a central fund, which is used to finance the renovation of housing and new provision, and is then replenished by rents again. So I know that Solveig from Denmark will talk about this very useful example later this morning. And a key benefit of this type of mechanism for funding affordable housing is that it provides a source of funding that's guaranteed and continuous, and also insulated from crisis in the availability of finance from government or from housing markets. So these are sort of some of the affordable housing funding and financing mechanisms we examine in the report. All of the mechanisms we examine are very effective in different contexts, but nearly all the mechanisms are quite complex to administer. And funding of affordable housing provision, guaranteeing of loans, provision of interest rate subsidies, etc., has very significant societal benefits, but also creates risks for government if they're not properly administered. Government ultimately backstops these loans. And also, if they're not properly managed, they can achieve perverse or unintended outcomes and contribute to house price inflation. So in the report, in order to address these risks, we suggest that it can be very useful to consider setting up what we call special purpose financial intermediaries to raise and manage finance for affordable housing. So this approach is particularly useful in countries where the social housing sector is small or it's fragmented, distributed between a lot of different social housing landlords. And Ireland is an example of a country with a relatively fragmented social housing sector, in that we have a lot of individual social housing landlords, each of which has a relatively small housing stock and a lot of difficulties in raising finance on the market. So in Ireland, it's a special purpose financial intermediary. The Housing Finance Agency has played a very useful role. And I know that Barry from the Housing Finance Agency is going to talk to you about its work this morning. But also we examine in the report other institutional models that can be used to raise funding for affordable housing finance, such as a cooperative model in Switzerland, and also the development bank model, which Josh mentioned in his report, is very common in Germany and very useful in the affordable housing sector. So in conclusion, the housing funding and financing chapter of the Housing 2030 report demonstrates that funding and financing tools can play a very useful role in channeling investment to support new affordable housing provision, and also subsidising and regulating housing costs. So it can play a very important role in addressing housing unaffordability problems. But to have a significant impact on housing affordability, we have to do more than just fix market failures and fill unprofitable gaps in the market. We also need to devise strategies to address the wider funding and financial market drivers of unaffordability. So not just to address the effects, but also address the causes. And more broadly, to shape and create a housing finance market we need. So that's just a flavour of the content of the Housing 2030 report. just to explain to you, we're still working on finalising the report. It's been an enormous challenge, but we are almost there. So thanks to everyone who supported that task. We plan to launch the report at the UNECE ministerial meeting in Geneva in October, and I really hope I get to attend that meeting in person. We're also working on the Housing 2030 website, so it's a very useful resource. Some of you may have found out about this event from the website. If you haven't, I'd really encourage you to visit. It includes many, many resources, videos, presentations, and over 15 podcasts. And we're planning to expand that to include 80 or more illustrations of good practices from around the UNECE world region, including some of the ideas we didn't manage to squeeze into the report. So thank you for listening, everybody. And I'm looking forward to taking your questions and participating in the remainder of this morning's seminar.
Many thanks, Michelle. What a great summary of a long and complex chapter that in draft at present has a huge amount of really high quality information about different opportunities and structures used in different places around the world. So morning everyone, and welcome to this Q&A session. I'm David Orr. I'm one of the two co-chairs of the Housing 2030 initiative. At this seminar, we are doing as we've done in the previous three, uncovering a whole range of really critical issues that are all capable of being resolved. This is a Q&A session that will allow participants to be able to ask questions of Michelle and of two other guests who are joining us now. Manuel Albers, who is a professor at the KU Leuven School of Geography and Tourism, specializing in the study of financial systems, especially their impact on housing markets through financialization, as we've been hearing about already, and their impact on housing formation and tenure choice. And our final panelist is Grzegorz Gajda, who is the senior urban sector specialist at the EIB. And his work includes analysis and appraisal of EIB investment in municipal housing and tourism projects, and is a consultant on the bank's municipal and housing investment policy. I should say that all three of those have provided podcasts which are available on the Housing 2030 webinar, and they are excellent. If you've not yet had a chance to listen to them, I do commend them to you because again, there is a whole range of really high quality information contained in them. I'm going to start, if I might, by asking the two panelists, not Michelle, not for the moment at least, but to ask our other two panelists. It's a kind of big, broad question, but do you think that there is enough money out there to be able to provide affordable homes for everyone? And if so, where does it come from? I suppose underlying that question is the kind of pretty fundamental thing. Can we fix this? Is it actually possible to house everyone in good quality, affordable homes? Let's start with Grzegorz.
I think that this question is a bit tricky one, because on one side, one can say, yes, there is enough money. When we work with our housing related clients, it's not that we ever been in a situation that demand for housing finance was bigger than available supply. So we can increase our lending to housing projects easily. So that is one part of the answer. On the other side, I would say that in order to provide affordable finance to all the people who need it, this is probably beyond any public sector finance institutions. Therefore, what really we need to create is the system that has finance being sourced through more market-related solutions, and this finance should be based on self-financing of these projects. And here, the source of the finance that really needs to be captured is all this value which is created by growing urbanization, which is still happening all over Europe and very visible in other parts of the world. Urbanization creates substantial value. However, not always the systems provide for distribution of the substantial value in an equitable way. We should be using public policy instruments more to redirect this urbanization value created to people who need this, who are vulnerable and whose income is insufficient. And through massive financialization of housing markets, this value is actually captured by only a very small group of very mobile capital. And I think this is what we observe in those statistics that have been presented earlier on ever-rising housing prices. That would be my answer to this. Thank you.
That's a great start. So, Manuel, we hear a lot about the financialization of housing. One of the things it demonstrates is that international capital has an appetite for investing in housing. There's a vast amount of money that's come into housing, but been used for a very narrow and unhelpful purpose. How can we change that round?
Yeah, thanks, David, for the introduction. I would definitely say there is enough housing, there is enough money going into affordable housing. There is more than enough. The problem is that most of it is going into making housing more expensive rather than affordable. Affordable housing is actively sought by landlords, both international corporate landlords and financial funds, as well as small-scale landlords, as a means to make money. So in addition, affordable housing is increasingly becoming too expensive to be affordable to many and most households. You could say that the meaning of affordability, in a way, in many policy discourses has completely lost its meaning, because very often it doesn't address the real affordability issues. So the question also assumes that money is the answer to affordability. And although money can be an answer, at the moment, I think the money going into affordable housing is doing more harm than good. So what we need is better regulation. And I think Michelle has discussed a whole range of options of what could help, a whole range of instruments that could help to create more affordable housing that is not something like simply pouring more money into housing markets. And I'm not going to discuss the whole list that Michelle went through. And I think in different contexts also, you will need a different mix of policy instruments. So I think it's great. I also saw the draft chapter by Michelle and Julie, that there's a whole range of examples being discussed. And it also shows in different countries already a lot of these experiments are being done. And some of them are not experiments. Some have been around for decades. But I think it is good to put more effort into creating affordable housing. But I think we also need to stop the disappearance of affordable housing. Because I think on a daily basis, affordable housing is still disappearing. So as long as we don't fix that problem, it's not really going to help enough in the end. And there's many ways to do that. And I think regulation of existing rents could be a very good way to start doing that. It's not enough, but that would be the thing to start with. There's many other things, again, many of them also discussed in the report. So in short, affordable housing is quickly disappearing because too much money is being invested in it. And we need better regulation and better instruments to protect affordable housing. And not all of those have to cost money.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. We're going to pick up on some of these in our discussion now. Can I just remind everyone, the Q&A box is the place to post your questions, and I will do my best to cover as many of the questions that come up in that Q&A box. So I'm going to go to Michelle. How do we ensure, Michelle, this is a question that Jose Ospina has asked in the Q&A box. How do we ensure that all these little community-based organizations, non-profit, small co-ops, the kinds of organizations that have a real commitment to their own communities can access the finance that they need, can access the private finance that they need, and can demonstrate that investing in affordable homes is actually a good, secure investment for people wanting patient, long-term return on their money?
Well, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think particularly for countries where there are a lot of small affordable housing providers and community initiatives, co-ops, etc., having a central agency that can manage the raising of funds, distribute it between small providers can be very useful. Another benefit of an agency centrally to do this is that, as some of the earlier speakers have said, in some ways we have too much money flowing into finance, not in every country, but certainly in the West. And there is a need for very specialist and expert advice to governments on how to manage some of this private finance and how to ensure that the state actually gets an equitable return, that there's no profiteering, etc. And that requires specialist intervention on the part of government to reflect the specialist expertise that is there in the private sector. There's one final issue just to flag based on my experience in Ireland. Ireland has, as I mentioned, a very fragmented in some ways social housing sector, but on the positive, we lots and lots of small community housing providers that play an enormously valuable role. And in this country, the Housing Finance Agency has helped them to access finance, done credit assessments, supported them in terms of financial management, but also just to say the work or the contribution of the European Investment Bank, as well as the Council of Europe Development Bank to the sector has been really important. And what it has enabled us to do is to offer long-term fixed rate loans that are much easier for small organizations to manage. They don't have interest rate risk, etc. And it makes the sector much more financially stable.
Okay. One of the questions that's come up on the chat box is about land. And I just want to say that land is one of the key chapters of the report that we've been working on. And there is already a lot of information on the Housing 2030 website about the work that we have done on land. We may come back to it during the course of this conversation, but perhaps we should continue to steer more towards some of the specifics about financing arrangements. So I'm going to ask a question that was posted by Alex Pigot. Is it possible to have two mutually exclusive housing markets? One that is basically organized by the state on state-owned land with regulation and a very clear commitment to affordability, and a separate one that is a private sector market that we can just let do what it wants to do. Manuel, it sounds like a neat solution, is it?
I mean, I'm not sure if it's a neat solution, but is it possible? Yeah, it is possible. But I mean, it would be an illusion that those markets wouldn't affect each other, because you might have one part of the market that becomes very expensive and another part of the market that's very affordable, which means that there's going to be a group that may not be able to get into that affordable part of the market and therefore has to go into the market part of the market, so to speak, the more commodified part of the market. So I think it sounds like a neat solution, but I think you're just creating a group for which you then have to expand that public market. So I think in the end, you may end up with an almost completely state-based housing market, which, you know, is not necessarily a bad plan in some cases, but it doesn't make sense to come up with the division and say like, okay, we have one part here and one part there, and we pretend that they're entirely loose and entirely separated. And yeah, I don't see how this would work for most people. I think you can have a market where you put some money to the side, but there will always be a group who doesn't qualify for the affordable part, and then it's going to have trouble getting something in the commodified market.
Okay, so Grzegorz, if the EIB provides long-term finance, it provides, you know, its job is to provide stable investment. So how can we get that kind of long-term investment into the small organizations that might be able to make a difference at a community level? I think the context for this question is, it is clear from all the work that we've done that we will never provide everyone with adequate affordable homes if we just leave it to the market to organize it. So it's about how we create mechanisms for those who have been failed by the market to still have access to good quality affordable homes. Is that something that's at the center of the EIB mission?
Well, it's very much at the center of the EIB mission. So we have been providing finance to large housing providers, basically big public housing entities present in many European countries, but also we've been providing finance to intermediary institutions like Housing Finance Institution in Ireland, but also in other countries as well. And this financing is then made available to smaller housing providers. And this is definitely our role, and we are very happy that we'll be able to support this. But there is also another side of this coin. There has to be a certain scale in provision of social and affordable housing, and this would be in about a couple of 100 units, because there is certain level of fixed costs that have to be covered anyway. So I would be cautious in being so optimistic about a big number of small institutions being able to efficiently provide this type of housing. But I wanted to comment on this other question of two different markets. I have to say that certainly it is possible and we can think about it, but is it good? I doubt it. I mean, you know, we don't really want to have ghettos, and one ghetto for rich people here and one ghetto for poor people there. I think countries in Europe have experimented with this in the past, and it has turned out to be a complete failure. And the governments are taking steps to reintegrate people and mix up the societies, because this is actually our European solidarity DNA, which basically says that until everybody is happy, nobody can be happy, and we have to work towards that goal. So our support wouldn't really be to create such separate housing markets, really.
So I must say that I agree with that comment, and I think it's very difficult to see in practice how these two different markets could exist without there being a relationship between them, some movement between them. And actually, to some extent, almost every nation has a conversation, a dialogue going on all the time between the impact of the private market and the role of the state and public institutions in how we manage these flows. And getting that balance right, I think, is critical to the way that we can deliver this objective of good quality, affordable homes. One of the questions, Michelle, that we've had is a lot of the examples. I know that the report has done a really good job in trying to provide examples from a whole range of different countries, but a lot of the examples are from Western European economies where there have been systems and structures in place for quite a long time. How can the less economically strong, smaller economies, which have been approaching this as a kind of new issue in the last 10, 15, 20 years, how can we take the learning from one economic environment and make it have relevance in a different one?
We have tried to draw on examples from all over the UNECE region, but I agree, you know, many of the most sophisticated and long-running and well-researched examples are from higher income countries. And there is a problem in just transferring that model to different contexts. So particularly in relation to finance for social housing, in higher income countries, it's drawn from markets, it's drawn from very long-standing, large, historically well-funded social housing landlords like in Denmark. And you can't—
You appear to have lost Michelle.
No, I can hear Michelle.
Yeah, thank you. You can't just apply that automatically to lower income countries. But saying that, some of the models can be reapplied. And I think the savings bank model is particularly valuable and useful one. It provides a new source of finance for housing. And in many countries, most households don't have bank accounts outside high income countries. So it is, this is a very valuable instrument that has been established in lots of countries and is used to finance mortgages. It's also a very good indicator of whether someone can repay a mortgage, their ability to accrue savings. I feel that it is not realistic to think that a substantial affordable housing sector can be developed without some government intervention. This happened there was very significant subsidies for affordable housing provision in Western Europe in the past, and this enabled us to develop large social housing sectors. So that also needs to be made available. And in the EU member states in the east of the EU, Slovakia is distinguished by the fact that it has managed to rebuild a very large social rented sector. And it did it on the back of primarily using a revolving fund funded by government. So it's a relatively simple instrument, but something that can be enormously beneficial.
So thank you, Michelle. I think that the moderator has lost the connection so far. I don't know if okay, maybe maybe Dara is joining now to pick up on where he left.
Yes, so indeed, I think we've lost David. Hopefully he'll be back with us momentarily, but in the meantime, I'll pick up. I'd maybe ask the same question that Michelle just answered. And from an EIB perspective, I know that you work a lot with what we might recall countries in transition. So what in your experience in working with the EIB has been the most important advice, or what structures really need to be in place in these sort of countries in transition to develop adequate affordable housing sectors?
Yes, actually, this is what we see elsewhere apart from the European core. I mean, in very many countries, both within the EU and outside of the EU predominantly, we see government observing the issue of affordable housing or lack thereof, and then they just think, okay, let's throw in some targeted mortgage subsidies. You know, we call it green mortgages, we call it youth mortgages, we call it whatever other mortgages, and they think that by throwing in some money on the demand side, very quickly they will be able to resolve this program. So we see programs, you know, 500,000 homes in Kenya, 100,000 new homes in Colombia. They are all very similar to each other, and they are all very similar in a way that they will fail. They actually fail each time they are being put in place. These countries learn very, very, very slowly, and they continue using the same policy models, and they observe situation that housing is actually much more expensive. I have to say, I live now in Luxembourg, which is considered to be one of the most expensive countries in the world, but actually housing in Nairobi and housing in Kiev costs either as much as in Luxembourg or more. So this is basically an example of wrong policies, and housing affordability is being addressed improperly. So our role here at the EIB is to promote solutions that have been based on solid economic theory research and based on examples that have worked elsewhere, and try to implement those solutions there. But it's a very difficult process actually, and I have to say that the global world of development finance institutions has still not grasped the affordable housing in a way as we do here, and they tend to favor solutions that I described in the beginning as inadequate, and this is quite a problem that we observe. we have some successes, and I think that maybe it will be also possible to listen to this from the Polish minister responsible for housing, because Poland, to me, is a country that really took a very good lesson from all those failures from the past. They phased out most of the, or even all of the demand side subsidies for housing purchase, and they focused very substantially on provision of new public housing. And I think it's actually a very good thing that they've done it, and we are supporting this as much as we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I realize we're coming towards the end of the session. I see David is still not back with us. He's obviously having some technical issues, but I might, Manuel, if I can come to you for one final question. It seems, so the JRC, the European Commission's Research Institute, had a very good report on the financialization of housing in Europe recently, in which they said that the financialization of housing is effectively a choice. It comes down to the degree to which you put in place good governance structures and the degree to which you open the door to the possibility of financialization. I mean, we see in many countries, for example, they have the REIT, the REIT model. I mean, is financialization a choice? Could governments effectively shut that door? And what impact might that have on countries or indeed urban areas which are heavily financialized today?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think to a certain extent, it is a choice. Real estate investment trusts, REITs, are an instrument that is only possible in a country if the national government has approved it. So national governments implement regulation to make REITs possible. The same is true for mortgage securitization. Mortgages can only be securitized, that is resold in the secondary market, if the national government has approved regulation. So I think part of our problem is that we tend to think that it's markets versus states, where the markets, if there's regulation there, it's doing something against the market. But in fact, a lot of regulation is there to make markets work. And sometimes it's there to make markets work for the good. Sometimes it's there to make markets work for a selective number of actors. And REITs and mortgage securitization are good examples of regulation that is lobbied for by specific market actors. So the whole frame that we often get, where supply side of the housing market doesn't want regulation, is not necessarily true. And we know this also from economic history, that markets come about when there is regulation. The state is in a way necessary to make markets possible. So for mortgage securitization and REITs, this is very clear. So the report of that European committee that you mentioned, I think is very good. They've consulted me for some of these things, and I asked them to address some of these issues about financialization. I think it's good. I'm not sure what's happening with it. I find it hard to understand what's happening with these kind of reports within the European sphere. But I think one problem is that the European Union, at the same time, is doing things to roll out mortgage securitization further. So the Capital Markets Union, I just put it in one of the answers to one of the questions in the chat box as well, is actually pushing mortgage securitization on countries that make little or no use of it. So that's mostly Central and Eastern Europe. And the European Union has basically says, well, because we have to have a different banking and finance system, it would be good if countries who don't have it yet make use of this. And there's a whole range of narrative around the Capital Markets Union. You should look up the promotional video where it basically suggests that there's a small entrepreneur, I think her name is Anna, and then there's a small investor, I think his name is Steve, and they come together, and then there's a brilliant solution because they don't need the bank anymore. But in practice, the Capital Markets Union is about big investors. It's not about entrepreneurs. There's nothing in the plans that will help small-term entrepreneurs. There's nothing that will necessarily help affordable housing. The idea is if you pump more money in housing, you will get more housing. But this is about buying up existing mortgages. This is not about creating more housing. So it's again the same problem that the European Union is repeating in the last few years, because this is a relatively new initiative. Is to think like, oh, if we pump more money in housing, everything will be better because we just throw money at it. And it's someone else's money, so it's even cheap. So governments can do something. They cannot implement mortgage securitization. And they can be very careful with REITs, or they can think like, well, maybe REITs can be great for offices. Maybe they're not so great for housing. We see that in a country like Germany, that for a long time was known to be one of the most affordable housing markets in Europe, a large rental market, most of it private rental, not social rental, was very affordable. This is rapidly changing because REITs and other big investors like hedge funds and private equity funds are massively buying up the housing. And despite all the instruments in place, and some of the ones that Michelle discussed are in place in Germany. Germany is one of the better systems in many ways. But still with those instruments in place, but with this massive money coming in from the City of London and Wall Street, it is very hard to keep the affordable housing affordable. So governments should in a way not facilitate those actors so easily as they do now. Sorry for that long answer.
No, it was perfect. And I see David is back with us. So David, I might let you close off the session. I know that you missed maybe the last few minutes, but I have trust and faith in you that you can do it adequately. So,
well, I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened to my internet. The trials and tribulations of Zoom webinars, I'm afraid. Thank you for stepping in, Dara. I think what we've done in this Q&A session so far is to uncover some of the real challenges that we have, because so many of the functions that we're dealing with now, I genuinely believe are unintended consequences of governments doing things that they thought would be useful. The problem is that they see these unintended consequences, but then don't change the policy. Certainly in the UK, we keep on having support for new owner-occupiers. These are demand-side subsidies, so the demand goes up, but the supply doesn't match it. And the consequence always is that house prices increase. So actually more money has gone in, but as others have been discussing, the consequence for the whole housing system is an adverse one, not a positive one. So we need to be able to kind of rethink some of those fundamentals. We're going to see some real live examples of things that have worked and worked well in the next session. But for now, huge thanks to Dara for stepping in, to Michelle, to Jagos, and to Manuel for their contribution. Now it's time for you to stand up, walk around, sing a little song, do a little dance, get some caffeine, have a break, and we'll see you back in 10 minutes.
All right, welcome back everyone. Hopefully you've had the opportunity to stretch your legs, get some fresh air, make a cup of coffee or tea or whatever your preference is. So we're going to move into the final session of the day, and I'll hand you over to the very capable co-chair of the Housing 2030 initiative, Elena.
Thank you very much, Serge. Thank you, Dave. Now we are approaching the practical part of our workshop, of our seminar, of our conference, and we will have 5 examples of these, I would say, best practices or the systems which worked well in providing for better affordability of housing. We have very good geographical coverage, and we shall start directly in a host country, in Ireland. And I will give the floor to Barry O'Leary, who is from Housing Finance Agency of Ireland. And he will speak about the role of the Housing Finance Agency in supporting affordable housing. So Barry, the turn is yours. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah, great.
Great. Thank you, Elena, and good morning. And thanks to the organisers of Housing 2030 for the invitation to speak today. I want to highlight a number of things that the HFA do and talk to you. Just to say, I've worked in the sector for over 30 years now at this stage, and which has changed quite a bit over those 30 years. Today, I was asked for an elevator pitch at a conference which is talking about opening up pathways to investment. This is very different from the bricks and mortar that we would have been talking about in 30 years ago. Just to tell you a little bit about the HFA, our role is to facilitate the delivery of social and affordable housing in Ireland. It sounds fairly simple. It is fairly straightforward. Our finance is one of the few parts of the housing sector in Ireland that is straightforward. We're a state-sponsored body. We're in business now for 40 years. Our competitive advantage is that we have access to low-cost, long-term fixed-rate finance with no profit motive. We make our money by borrowing cheaply, adding a small margin, and lending cheaply. We have over 5.2 billion in outstanding loans at this stage with no arrears. And the no arrears doesn't mean that we're risk adverse. It just means that we use some risk mitigation to limit our exposure. Our next 5-year strategy will see us double our loan book to over 10 billion. So if Dara can move on to the next slide, hopefully there are 6 things that are going to appear on the screen in front of you. And the question is, am I talking about COVID vaccines or am I talking about housing? So we have a situation where demand exceeds supply. We have an over-reliance on the private sector to deliver. State money has facilitated a quantum leap. There's no silver bullet available. Everyone thinks they should be prioritized, and there are blockages in the system. In truth, we need vaccines for all, and we need housing for all. The financial crisis of over a decade ago saw a big change in how social housing was funded in Ireland, with a move from capital to revenue funding. So approved housing bodies were asked to take on borrowing to move away from their grant-based system in the past. And in return for the borrowing, they would get a lease type payment, giving them 92% of market rent over the life of the loan. And they used that income to remunerate the loan. This incentive was designed to help them build their balance sheets. In the early days of us lending to approved housing bodies, yields were as high as 10%, have fallen to about 5% now as approved housing bodies have their balance sheets strengthened. And this is still a pretty good return in a negative interest rate environment. So 10 years ago, we started lending to approved housing bodies and there was no regulation at all in place. Some months ago, we completed the transition to a point where there's statutory regulation now, and I think this will be very good for the industry and will attract additional players in the market. The Housing Finance Agency borrows its money from the European Investment Bank and the Council of Europe Development Bank, amongst others. And we get sustainable loans from both of those banks with a citizen improved ethos attached to them. So it helps deliver A-rated houses which reduce fuel poverty. So the HFA acts as the financial intermediary. Our lack of profit motive means that our finance delivers better outcomes. By way of illustration, our 25-year fixed rate at the moment to approved housing bodies is 1.75%. So if we go on to the next slide, we talk about the challenges that are faced in the housing sector in Ireland. Approved housing bodies have delivered quite a lot in the last 5 years, but on their own, they really won't be enough. Others in the sector really need to now bring some delivery forward. And there are three areas that I just wanted to touch on. Local authorities, or municipalities, I think they'd be better known as in Europe, success will not be achieved without a significant additional delivery by municipalities. Their cost of borrowing from ourselves is cheaper than approved housing bodies, and it means that the delivery of homes is about 1/3 cheaper than approved housing bodies. So they have a lot to add to this situation. Approved housing bodies, we have three very good-sized organizations in operation in the country, and at the moment they account for over 70% of the business that we've done in that area in the last year. So there is an issue where concentration issues might arise, but we think that this can be mitigated by a diversity of delivery, and that's why we think that delivery from municipalities is very important. There's a growing issue for first-time buyers, I think, in Ireland. A recent report shows that the average age of a first-time buyer in the last 2 decades has gone up from 25 years of age to 35 years of age. And this creates a huge issue in terms of the demand for rental properties. And perhaps even more importantly, it causes stress for middle-aged men whose adult children don't leave their nest. So we think that there's strong need for diversity of delivery. Our low-cost fixed-rate funding is a sustainable basis to deliver these houses that are required. State has to move to a more affordable model, and we think this is the way forward in the next 5 years. It may well be that municipalities and approved housing bodies will have to start using special purpose vehicles to facilitate delivery. And as the industry gets more professional, and it is already very professional, I think the need for financial intermediaries could easily increase. What are the solutions that we're offering? On the next slide, Dara, the Occam's razor I mentioned. The theory in Occam's razor is that whenever a complex problem presents itself, often the simplest solution is the right one, the one to go for. And what we're saying is that HFA finance can deliver better outcomes. Its finance is only useful if it enables the delivery of more homes in Ireland. We need to ask, why are investors so happy to invest in the Irish property market at the moment? And the answer is, as highlighted by Josh Ryan this morning, the returns are quite high. And our contention is that state can get a return for its money and get value for its money by investing at this stage, using the HFA as facilitators of the activity. Our low rates and general rates available at the moment are so low that we think it's a unique opportunity to invest in social housing and affordable housing. Our contention would be that the COVID response shows what's possible with a whole of government approach, and there's been significant progress made. We need to make the same sort of progress in the housing world. We feel there's probably a need for a wide-scale building program which will deliver a serious stimulus to the economy. On the social housing side, we think that we need to move to a cost-based model rather than a market-based model, move away from a link to rents and actually look at what it costs to remunerate the loan, and that can be cheaper and better value for the state. State's current priority is to try and deliver more cost rental, and in the last year it has just introduced a new model, and we're happy to be funding the first cost rental Pathfinder project out in the suburbs of Dublin, with 2 of our customers, Respond and 2 housing associations, who've combined to deliver that project. And we're happy to say that since February of this year, we have approved loans for about 100 million for 8 additional projects across Dublin, Cork and Kildare, which will just prove the concept of how cost rental can work in Ireland. So we also think that there's scope for more use of the state's Rebuilding Ireland Home Loan facility, which is a mortgage facility offered to people who can't get mortgages with commercial banks. And the reality is that that mortgage costs a lot less to remunerate than the cost of rent in Ireland at the moment. So we think there's plenty of scope there. On the climate front, we think there are plenty of opportunities in retrofitting existing housing stock, and there's low cost finance can be delivered there, again, to improve the lot of the citizen and reduce fuel poverty and climate emissions. And on the rural resettlement side of things, there's opportunities. I think COVID has also delivered information to us there that shows that living in the country and not traveling into the cities is quite an attractive option. So I think we should do that and move towards that. So at this stage, I think it's probably time for me to wrap up. You've been in the elevator for long enough. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Barry, and thank you very much for describing also the role of the municipalities in using the potential of your fund, because I think this can be very inspiring also for the countries which are not so aware of the role of municipalities in supporting affordable housing. Thank you very much. Now we will move to France, and we will have Virginie Toussaint, the L'Union Sociale pour l'Habitat, and she will speak about the very special case of the French Livret A system, a counter-cyclical fund for social housing. So Virginie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you for the organization and the invitation. Yes, I will share with you the finance system based to produce social housing in France. So next slide, please. So just a brief introduction at what is Union Sociale pour l'Habitat. It's the French Federation representing the more than 400 social housing providers, which are public, non-for-profit or cooperative. We are housing more than 10 million people, and we have a dedicated mission defined by national authorities. You can see that we still have a large demand. 2 years ago, it was estimated to 2.1 million people waiting for a social housing in France. What is really remarkable in our system is it's 4 years now we are facing various reforms, including big cuts, which has an impact on the way how we are producing. Next slide, please. So we have a national objective on the 25% of social housing production at local level. And to achieve this, we are supposed to produce as social housing provider 125,000 units per year. So it represents a huge number of investment, as you can see on my slide. And how we can achieve this, it's a combination of different tools, which are housing allowances for 8 billion, but mainly dedicated loans coming from Caisse des Dépôts, which is the system which I will present now. You can see that the mandate of my members are the property of the Caisse des Dépôts. We have quite 80% of our loans coming from Caisse des Dépôts. So next slide, please. This is the great thing that we have in France. It's called the Livret. It's private saving books. Every people in France have one. I have one. My son have one. Usually we open it when we have a birth in the family. And it's really the main tool of the social housing production in France. Next slide, please. So how does it work? So the Livret A is the available saving for people, accessible in every bank and centralized by a dedicated investment bank, which is called Caisse des Dépôts, who is transformed in long-term loan of more than 40 years for social housing provider with an interest rate fixed by nationality. So today the rates of the Livret A is 0.5%, and the formula to achieve to this kind of loans is a rate index between the last 12 months of inflation and an average between Euribor and IONA rates. So you can see that there's a high amount of money on Livret A today, and it's because of this stability of the system that we are able to continue to produce a large number of social housing units. And what is remarkable is this, it's existing more than 100 years, it never failed. So next slide, please. So I shared with you to give you an idea of what is the part of this kind of loan and the other help and the other framework that we can use to produce social housing, some data that we are collecting internally within Union Sociale pour l'Habitat. So you can see that the loans are a large part of the way how we are financing the production. Next slide, please. So you see, it's not purple, I know in English, but I didn't find how I can say move. So the Livret A is, as you can see on this picture, is the purple part. So you can see how high is the use of this system to finance social housing in France. The growing part in blue is our own fund that we are investing in each new program to be able to produce, because then you can see the grants coming from the state are decreasing. But I'm sure it's all everywhere the case, as we can see in the Housing Europe report produced by Alice Pittini. Next slide, please. You have here the way how the loans are calculated according to the rate of Livret A. We have three kinds of loan that we can request for produce new social housing building. There is three different kind of loan because there's three different kind of interest and three different kind of people who can access according their revenue and their social needs. And you have also, depending the geographical area, Paris or not, because in Paris it's higher cost to find a place to live. You have also the different price we suppose to be rent, because the rented price per square meter we are obliged by law to propose to our tenants is depending the kind of loans we manage to have with the Caisse des Dépôts according the Livret A system. Next slide, please. So I would like to share with you a very strange information from coming from the last event within the COVID crisis. If we can see a higher demand for social housing because of social situation of people after and during this crisis, we can also see that people who are able to save money are saving much more money than before. So we can see the rate of the amount of money saved of Livret A in the blue line on the first graph is increasing. So the question, is there money to invest in social housing? Coming from private people, yes, there is some money. And it will also increase the appetites of our economic operators, because we are in competition for this Livret A, because as you understand, it's a useful and efficient way to produce social housing without putting public money directly, because it's private saving, so it's not costing to states, but also people, of course, other kind of economic actors would like to be beneficiaries of this kind of system. So for conclusion, I would like to share with you another kind of way we can work to produce social housing in combination always with Caisse des Dépôts. It's the last European alliance that our sector concludes within European and Council of European Bank. It's a bank intermediation to produce global loans with fixed rate. So it's a complementary product for social housing enterprise to be able to reach their objective. It's about 650 million dedicated for a new offer. So I hope I was enough fast but enough clear mainly to present our system.
You were not, but it was such an interesting story. Thank you very much. On one hand, we can only envy you this 100 years of stability. On the other hand, it is very inspirational. It's a huge inspiration because one sees that this is really the way how to build in a proper and stable way something which can work from there for decades. Thank you very much. Now we will move to Denmark and we will learn again from Solveig Robert-Tingay, who she comes from the Danish Federation of Not-Profit Housing Providers. And she will speak about the Danish National Housing Fund, another very stable European case, which is really well worth listening and following. Solveig.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elena. I'm very pleased to be here and to give you a perspective on the Danish experiments with a national building fund. I represent the Danish Federation of Non-Profit Housing Providers. Could you go to the next slide there? Yeah. Let me start by giving you a brief insight into the Danish housing sector. Overall, social and affordable housing plays a big part in the Danish housing market. Or about 500,000 homes in the sector is social and affordable. This corresponds to every fifth home. In regards to the tenants, or in regards to the population, every sixth Dane live in a social or affordable housing home. So this is almost 1 million Danes. The aim is of the sector, our aim is to offer people of all kinds good quality and decent housing at an affordable rent level, but also giving influence to the tenants on their own housing condition. This is a particular focus of the Danish model. If you go to the next slide. My focus today will be on the National Building Fund, which is a critical institution at the heart of the non-profit and affordable housing in Denmark. It was established all the way back in 1967 as a self-governing institution with the purpose to increase self-financing within the affordable and non-profit housing sector. In spite of its name, the National Building Fund, it's actually a private fund that is financed by the tenants in social housing and affordable housing homes. So 1/3 of the capital comes from rent contributions from tenants, and this goes into the National Building Fund and is collected and kept here together with loans from different municipalities. So the funds are keep the rent, and they reinvest and redistribute it across the entire sector. In this way, it enhances self-financing within the social and affordable sector in Denmark. So there's a strong sense of solidarity across the entire industry, and the National Building Fund plays a big part in this. If you go to the next slide. A little bit about what the funds are used for. The state controls how much the National Building Fund can fund each year. So there are limits for how much funding can come from the National Building Fund. It finances the expansion of new affordable and social housing and renovation work of existing properties. This includes improvements both inside the buildings, outside the buildings, energy improvements, etc. The National Building Fund is also able to finance the demolition cost in more vulnerable social housing areas and to support more infrastructural changes in areas as these. And the fund provides support for economically and strained housing organization. But a particular focus of the fund is also social and preventive measures, as you can see on this figure. This is investments in rental price reductions, social activities to get people or tenants into employment, youth into education. So there is a particular social focus also in the fund and in the investments of the funds. Altogether, it supports the sustainable, affordable housing developments in Denmark, and it ensures high standards of affordable homes and surroundings. If you go to my next slide, this is an example of what the National Building Fund supports. This is a material master plan, which requires, when you get the support from the National Building Fund, you have to develop a unified plan, what we call a master plan, and you have to have the local government support. A master plan works strategically with developing the landscape and enhancing also the sense of community in housing areas, as well as the infrastructure and the buildings. Here you see an example from Aarhus, which is the second largest city in Denmark, Ny Rosenhøj, that's a housing area here. And you can see the transformation before on the left side and on the right side after these renovation and improvement works. Before the transformation, the area was known for being a more deprived and isolated housing estate located just outside Aarhus. It consisted of these 27 concrete blocks, as you can see, and was characterized by a more poor social and physical image, with high crime rates, more people being out of employment, and lower educational rates. So during a 5-year period, this area went through tremendous improvements supported by funds from the National Building Fund, and the buildings went through extensive facade works, demolishing of building blocks. Some blocks were demolished, there was also construction of newer and slimmer blocks. There was new infrastructure, modernization of buildings to include access for elderly and disabled people, but also establishing balconies to opening up the surroundings for tenants living inside the buildings, but also to the outdoor community. So there are various approaches here have improved the area on several levels, both economically, environmentally, because the buildings have gone through some energy improvements, and socially in much sense, because it's attracted some other tenants than before the renovation. So the physical transformation has succeeded in radically lowering the moving frequency, attracting new types of residents. I just said that before, and to modernize the apartments. So all in all, this is just an example of what the National Building Fund and how critical it is for the social housing and affordable housing sector in Denmark, because it supports a more sustainable development of our building stocks. But it also maintains a high housing standard of all affordable and social housing, because it gives supports to different parts of the landscape, but all housing stock. So this was the example I would like to bring to the table today, just short and brief, and I would like to say thank you.
Thank you very much, Solveig. And thank you very much for really underlying also the fact that the fund is not only the financing institution, that it is something which really keeps the much broader picture in mind and supports actually involvement of municipalities, of people, and really fulfilling the principles of Geneva UN Charter on environment, economy, social and cultural inclusion. So it's a really great case. Thank you very much. Now we will move to Spain, and we will move to Barcelona, and we will have Javier Buron Cuadrado, who comes from the housing division of Barcelona City Council, and he will speak about Barcelona's efforts to contain rental prices to keep housing affordable. Please.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the invitation, and I will try to cover everything in a few minutes. If we can go to the next slide, please. Here you can see the framework, the situation in which we are right now. I won't go into detail because it's very similar to the situation in other member states, but we have a small social housing stock, little public investment in housing, especially at state and regional level. We have had an increase in rental housing prices until the coronavirus. We have a soft regulation in private rental market until recently, as I will tell you. And we have a weak public-private collaboration in financing and managing until now. We don't have many PPP projects in affordable housing. Next slide, please. In opposition to what we have heard in the previous examples, we are trying to construct or to get together a model from bottom to up, because we don't count with institutions, as you have referred previously, the public banking in Ireland or in France, or the Livret A, as we have been told. So we have to provide with means at local level and try to provoke the dynamics at regional and state level. So all these solutions that I'm going to comment, they are local solutions, and in a way they are pilots that they could evolve at regional and state level if we have enough consensus. What we are doing mainly, we are increasing the housing rental public stock through construction, more than 8,000 units. Some of them in industrialized construction, which is something kind of new here in Spain right now. We are also acquiring houses and buildings in the private market through different ways of preferential right to buy. We are also engaging in agreements with private owners in order to use temporarily housing in several affordable schemes. We have 3 right now. And we are also trying to launch 2 different strategies in order to collaborate with private partners, because all the instruments that I have quoted until now, they are mainly direct public action. But with these 2 instruments, we have to engage with the non-profit and with the limited profit market. The first one of these 2 devices is called Habitatge Metropolis Barcelona. It wants to be a housing association with our approach, which means 50% of the equity will be public and 50% of it will be private, with only one partner. We are intending to build 4,500 affordable units in the next 10 years. It's a metropolitan project, and the private investment that is expected, it goes from close to 60 million to a bit more than 100 million. Key data, 23 of this April, we will be selecting the final tender because we have 3 bids. And in a reasonable short period of time, we will be engaging in the first phase of this project, building the first 800 units in order to affordably rent them right away. The second project is different because we are not targeting the commercial market. We are engaging with cooperatives and with foundations, non-profit associations, with which we have previous relations, because we have 10 projects already working in place that they amount 250 units, but we are engaging right now in a framework that will cover land for 1,000 units in 10 years in order to produce affordable rent and co-housing. In both cases, the land, it will be public. In fact, in all the cases that I have been explaining, the land that is used is public and is handed in leasehold for 75 to 99 years. So this key factor of land property, we have it really clear, and we know that is extremely crucial. On top of this, we are collaborating to change in the change of the zoning, inclusionary zoning laws. In fact, right now in Barcelona city, we have a 40% and 30% threshold that I don't have time to go into detail, but they are the highest in the area. And we are the only place in Spain in which we have inclusionary zoning obligations for affordable rental. As well, we have regulated the tourist use of apartments through planning instruments. And in the meantime, because all these measures, what they are trying to do is to provoke a jump in public and PPP projects from the 7,000 units that we used to have 5 years ago to more than 15 and hopefully farther on. And we could say that all this is like 1 billion affordable housing lab in motion, mainly using municipal budget, also other resources as private equity and public banking funding. But all this, it will take some time in order to provoke results. So next slide, please. In the meantime, we have to act, and what we have done through lobby from the city to the regional authorities is to pass a law at the Catalan level that is binding from October of last year, in which mainly the law designs 60 municipalities as tense markets. And in these tense markets, during the contracts, the price can only increase the index of the consumption prices. And between contracts, and this is fairly new because we are importing the French and the German model, they have to respect two limitations. They cannot be higher than the previous contract, if there was a previous contract, and they cannot be higher than an official index that the Catalan regional government has put in place. There are some exceptions, mainly build to rent, luxurious developments, and also renovation in some conditions. The question that is always is this system working? Is too early to answer, because as I have told you, the system has been only in place for several months. But I show you this map, which is targeting the decrease of rental prices at national level from March 20 to March 21, all the period of the coronavirus. And as you can see, there is a general reduction, but I draw your attention to two different areas of the map. Madrid, which is the biggest and the most dense metropolitan area, the prices are decreasing a bit more than 10%. And in Barcelona, which is the second largest and more dense metropolitan area, the prices are going down a bit more than 14%. There is a difference between Madrid and Barcelona behavior right now of around 25%. It's too early to call, but we will have to follow the events. And wrapping up, I would say that we are trying to do as much as we can with our limited resources in order to use public land only for general interest purposes. So all the regulations in order to put land to work towards affordability is key for us. And at the same time, we are lobbying and trying to make change in Catalan and national laws in order to regulate the markets, especially the financial market, in a better way, and also to change the taxation in order to switch towards affordability. And I would thank you again for the chance to be with you, and excuses for my English, which at a high pace is even worse.
Thank you very much, Javier. Thank you very much for this very interesting story, which describes the variety of approaches which Barcelona is taking to increase proportion of affordable housing. Again, something very inspirational also for the countries in my region. I come from Slovakia. Thank you very much. And now, last but not least, we are coming to our last speaker, Mrs. Anna Kornecka. She is Deputy Minister of Economic Development, Labor and Technology of Poland. And we are very pleased and honored to have you with us, Madam Deputy Minister. And I hope that you will be speaking about making use of EU structural funds for the development of affordable housing, right?
Yes, thank you very much. At the beginning, I would like to welcome everyone and present some housing problems in Poland. One of the main problems in housing sector in Poland is housing overcrowding. There are no statistical lacks in housing stock as long as we compare the number of dwellings and the number of households. But there is an actual problem with access to affordable housing for people with lower or average income. One of the solutions for this problem is to increase the number of newly built dwellings, especially in the social housing sector. Unfortunately, the European structural funds cannot be used as a support for such actions. This is why the support for new social housing in Poland comes from the national funds. The housing policy instruments in Poland are responding to COVID-19 epidemic time. Since municipalities are responsible for community housing construction, one of the main obstacles is their insufficient activity, also in using available dedicated measures. Municipalities have a wide range of tasks and authorities often put other priorities first. To enhance communities and other social entities like cooperatives or social housing associations, in 2020, Polish government introduced several new regulations. I will always only tell you about the new regulations because the housing program is much more wider and I don't have so much time to describe it. So the first was the creation of the Government Housing Development Fund. It is about 350 million euro supporting municipalities in realization of social housing. This is the part that the National Property Resource is in charge of. The second is more favorable rules for communities applying for governmental grants for social housing construction and also for renovation of housing stocks for the poorest. And this is about 80% support, up to 80% of investment costs, so such huge support for social housing. Third, more favorable rules for social housing associations and also cooperatives, building cooperatives, applying for the preferential loans for new social housing construction. And the fourth is the additional financial support for tenants who lost their income during the pandemic time. When it comes to structural funds, also the past experiences from 2014 to 2020 and from 2021, the future period 2021 to 2026, the actions for housing sector financed with the share of the structural funds are mainly targeted at renovations and the improvement of the energy efficiency in buildings. These are very important tasks because they affect several problematic issues connected with the conditions of living. Thanks to the improvement of building performance, we can achieve lower costs of housing maintenance, which can result in decreasing problem of the energy poverty, which is really a big problem in Poland. Better installations of the house and connection to heating grid affects also in the smaller emission of pollution. That is why Poland plans to continue the use of the structural funds to support thermomodernizations and poorly insulated detached houses, which are one of the main sources of air pollution in Poland. Also, some of the introduced instruments will focus on the renovation of council buildings, which will respond to the problems of tenants in difficult situations. In this sector, structural funds were used and will be used in the next programming period. We would also like to continue the usage of structural funds as a help for residents with special needs. We all know that challenges for housing are not only technical issues, but also social ones. Thanks to European funding, the development of universal design could be supported and developed in housing sector. This is particularly important when facing the problem of an aging population, which is a serious challenge for the Polish society for coming decades. And when it comes to recovery fund and projected national recovery plan, we can develop some new instruments which will serve to improve housing condition. The National Recovery Plan will provide new support for energy efficiency in housing sector. First of all, we plan the increased thermal modernization bonus for investments involving deep thermal modernization. Deep thermal modernization means that the energy performance of refurbished buildings will be the same as the new constructed one. We also plan to create an instrument to support the usage of renewable energy sources like photovoltaics or heat pumps in the multi-family buildings, up to 50% of investment costs. To address the problem of energy poverty in social housing and to support local governments in improving the condition of the public housing stock, we are going to introduce the additional bonus for renovations and thermomodernization in municipal buildings. We also plan to support linked interventions, thermomodernizations of residential building connected with a refurbishment of social apartments, which are in these buildings. The governmental support of 50% will be increased to 80% or even 90% of investment cost when it comes to historic and revitalized buildings. We will also support the use of renewable energy sources in newly built social housing stock. It means the installation during construction process, it is really still a problem in Poland. With the new instrument, the cost of installation of renewable energy source will be covered by the government in 50%. This is the shortage of our plans for the future. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present Polish housing policy instruments, these introduced in 2020.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much for also learning that the Poland is this very strategic step in really formulating the broad and well-based housing policy, the new approach to housing policy, which really considers environment, social aspects, and things in a long term. I think that this is the way how we shall do that. I would like to thank now all the speakers in our panel, and all the interventions will be then on our webpage of Housing 2030 for those who had not a chance to follow all the whole program. Now it's actually the time to summarize. The topic of today's was financing. But actually, if I go back to our keynote speaker, he said one sentence that today real estate is a new gold. And I think that the biggest challenge is how to make this new gold serve the society. And the answer is not only in financial instruments. We have seen really plenty of different approaches, different possibilities of different tools which can help. But I think that the answer is in the fact that recent housing policies very often are rather narrow. They only concentrate on how to fight the market failure. But very rarely the policies go deeper into the issue why these market failures are happening and what is the reason for these market failures. And we have heard several times in the contributions that the answer to that is in a better regulation. It is in a better, stronger, more robust national housing policies, in more stronger and rational involvement of public hand in the market, than ensuring affordable housing for all, because we can't be facing a longer term growing gap between rich and poor. We have to intervene, and we see the countries who are doing this and who are doing this for a longer period. They are actually getting better and stronger hand in this game. So this is my summary of today. And I hope that the ministers who will meet in October in Geneva will use this richness of experiences across Europe in last decades and will react in a proper way. And the new housing policies across UNECE region will reflect on the possibilities to improve the everyday life of our citizens. Now I will pass to David.
Thank you, Elena. What a fascinating day we've had. I've been sitting reflecting on this event and indeed the other 3 webinars that we've had. 4 really important events as part of this whole Housing 2030 process. And there are a number of things that seem very clear from the various conversations that we've had. The first is that to a greater or lesser extent, all countries struggle a bit to ensure that we have adequate affordable homes for everyone. It is a difficult challenge, but too often I think we see it only as a challenge, and we fail to see the opportunity that comes with meeting this objective. I have argued before, and no doubt will argue again, that the provision of good quality affordable housing makes a direct positive contribution to delivering 16 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Providing good quality affordable homes gives everyone a much stronger basis in their own lives to be able to fulfill their own potential, to be the people that they are capable of being. If you do not have a safe, secure, affordable home, it is much more difficult to make use of education opportunities, to find employment opportunities, to engage productively with the world around you. And all that we've heard through these 4 webinars, and I think reinforced today, says that there are tens of thousands of organizations out there with goodwill, big heart, very keen, even determined to play their part in meeting this challenge of ensuring that we are all well housed. But the thing that is at the heart of this, whether it's about land use or environmental issues and energy sustainability, whether it's about how we value and price land, whether it's governance structures, whether it's about how we finance our new homes, the thing that makes the biggest difference is clear, committed political engagement. It is political will that says we have to have a long-term national housing strategy. It's political will that determines that changes will be made to the way that we regulate the buying and selling of land, changes to the way that we regulate how investment happens in our housing. And that's why it is so important that this report is presented to ministers in October. And why at the heart of the work that we've all been doing is the challenge not just to demonstrate that it is possible to do it, but to convince those people in positions of political authority that it is in the interests of them, their nations, their economies, their societies, to ensure that we can use all of these opportunities to meet that challenge of providing good quality, affordable homes for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for those inspiring words, and indeed, Elena, for all of your contributions today. And I'd just like to conclude very quickly by, I know we've mentioned it already, but just to explain to the attendees. Oh, my apologies. I'm in the, sorry, there's some gremlins in the system, I think. I'll close out a PowerPoint and open back up. But just to quickly thank all of the speakers today, all of those of you who attended. We came very close to reaching 500 people registered for this event, showing how important this is as an issue. So I'd just like to quickly mention the next steps in the process. So Housing 2030 began roughly this time last year, and this is the final conference. Hopefully, yes, hopefully now you can see my screen properly. So just briefly on the next steps. As already been mentioned, the presentation of the final report will be at the UNEC ministerial meeting on the 6th and 7th of October 2021. That will be broadcast online, so we hope to see as many of you there either in person or virtually. And indeed, at that event, we will also be relaunching, rebranding, and kind of refocusing the Housing 2030 website, housing2030.org, which will include links to all of the best practices that have been collected as part of this process. But indeed, we want this to be an ongoing process. So what we do not want to have happen is that we come to October, we publish the report and we say that was a good process, but we're kind of done. We need Housing 2030 to live on long after October. And that is where all of you come in. So if you do have any examples of good practices around finance, around land, around environmental sustainability, or around governance related to promoting affordable housing, then we want to hear from you. You can get in touch with us through housing2030.org. And as I said, we want this project to live on. We don't want this to be something that we put a lot of effort into and that eventually fizzles out. So this isn't the last you've heard of us, I can assure you of that. So thank you again for your presence here today, and hopefully we'll hear from you